Okay. Well, I want to, I guess, kind of react to a video I saw a little bit earlier today. I didn't watch the whole thing, but most of it. But it really got my attention. It's really interesting stuff, and I like it because it's from a kind of a scholarly perspective. You know, with PhDs talking and stuff. I much prefer to listen to PhDs than anyone else when it comes to historical reliability, anything theological, whatever. So I want to go over this. It's a Wesley Huff video. He just put it out today, and I started watching like within 2 minutes of it getting released. I'm like, I'm gonna put this on my channel tonight. So he's gonna go over kind of a historical reputability of the text, like that the Gospels and the Book of Acts are taking themselves seriously as historical documents and eyewitness reports, and how you can see evidence of that on textual statistical analysis of things like distribution of names mentioned in the text, etc. A few other things too. So I'm going to watch it and kind of go over it with my 2 cents as we go. So here we go.
Jordan, I go to church every Sunday.
The stuff they believe is obvious nonsense. You don't believe Jesus rose from the dead, surely?
I choose to believe that Jesus rose from the dead.
The uncanniness of Jesus in the Gospels is either a literary mystery or they are articulating something that was genuine.
Many of us can walk 99% of the way there in terms of belief in the truth of the story. Or as Betjeman puts it, but is it true? Is it true?
Secular historians, and they look at the data and they say, whatever's going on, the disciples believe something happened.
Yeah, I
that
agree.
they saw something.
Of course.
Why then, in seeing their friends die, do they continue to go on and do it?
I think they definitely believed it was true.
If I went back in time with a Panasonic video camera, would the little LCD screen show a man walk out of that tomb?
I would suspect yes.
Wow, it's so funny the way he says it. I would suspect yes. I always laugh at. I've seen that clip before.
Oh, that's really amazing. Fascinating subject. It really is. Most people barely scratch the surface of this stuff.
So in the Gospel of Luke, there's a weird little detail where the writer identifies Joanna as the wife of Chuza, the household manager of Herod Antipas. Now, Chuza is a rare name, and the surviving evidence suggests it was of Nabatean origin. It's a strange little obscure detail we typically gloss over, but details matter. So why would a man with a Nabatean name hold that position in the household of a Galilean ruler?
Josephus solves the riddle for us, without obviously intending to, and tells us that Herod Antipas was married to a Nabatean princess for many years as part of like a political alliance.
So Luke makes an offhand mention of someone with a Nabatean name managing Herod's household. Josephus gives us a piece of historical context that makes that otherwise unexplained detail fit. Luke never explains the connection in Herod's household.
So this guy's mentioned by Luke offhand. Chuza, Herod's household manager. This name, Chuza, is of Nabatean origin. And then Josephus, an independent historian who has no skin in the game of what Luke is talking about. Josephus does not believe that Jesus rose from the dead. He's a Jewish historian from like the time of the Roman occupation and the AD 70 and onward when they took down the temple and everything. He's around that time writing his histories. And he takes himself seriously as a historian. And then you've got him saying Herod married a Nabatean princess. So it would no surprise that a Nabatean princess would have a manager or have someone in her household that she brought along named Chuza who has a Nabatean name. So independently, Luke's offhand and Joseph's kind of just mentioning that makes a connection that's, Luke's actually paying attention historically to what's going on. Luke's in the history, like he's there. He's at the time. He's lived it. So this starts to make Luke a believable author. And Luke is one of the four Gospels. One of the four original legitimate gospels, as opposed to the apocryphal Gnostic gospels that came a century later, etc.
Josephus gives us a piece of historical context that makes that otherwise unexplained detail fit. Luke never explains the connection, and Josephus is not trying to explain Luke.
It really points to Luke having real, authentic insider knowledge into who Joanna was and who her husband was.
You would expect to find details to match up like this if the gospel writers were drawing on real people and real events. But that is just one name. What happens when we take hundreds of ordinary details like it and apply a similar test? And when we apply the same test to ancient histories and works of fiction, which ones hold up?
People don't just walk up and say, "Hi, I'm sexually interested in you."
Skip.
The New Testament repeatedly presents eyewitness testimony as the foundation of these events. Luke opens his gospel by explaining that he drew from material delivered by those who had been eyewitnesses from the beginning. He says that he investigated everything carefully and wrote an orderly account so that his reader could have certainty about the things that he had been taught.
I checked into it.
John makes the same appeal more personally. First, could have certainty.
To make it clear, Luke 1:1 through 4, so at the beginning of his gospel, he makes it very clear what he's all about, what he's trying to accomplish. That he has checked things out. He found eyewitnesses, things that may he not have seen. He found the eyewitnesses who did and used them as source material. And he tries to put it in an orderly, almost mostly chronologic, carefully researched historically account. That was Luke's, when he set out to write his gospel, that was what he's trying to accomplish.
About the things that he had been taught.
I checked into it.
John makes the same appeal more personally. First John speaks of that which we have heard, seen with our eyes, and touched with our hands. John's gospel says, "He who saw it has borne witness," and later identifies its source as the disciple who is bearing witness about these things, and who has written these things down. Acts also treats eyewitness presence as a central apostolic testimony. When the apostles replace Judas, they require someone who has accompanied them throughout Jesus' ministry. And Peter later declares, "We are witnesses of all that he did." These are explicit claims that the accounts are rooted in the testimony of people who were there. But claiming to preserve eyewitness testimony and demonstrating it are two different things. Today, we can test their ordinary details against inscriptions, ancient histories, name databases, and works of fiction in ways their authors could never have anticipated. My goal in this video is to ask whether the Gospels contain historical reportage, writings that draw on real sources and attempts to report what actually happened.
Well then, let's put it to the test, shall we?
I spoke with 4 scholars approaching that evidence from different directions. Some of the evidence is already well established, while some comes from the latest developing research. We'll organize it around 4 key questions. Were these accounts written close enough to the events? Do their details hold up when tested? Do we find the same patterns in comparable histories and works of fiction? And do these details point back to eyewitness testimony? These questions.
Every one of these he goes through, and they're really good. But it serves to show that these are written as history. Whether you choose to believe the eyewitness account is a different story. But it's written from the perspective of someone not trying to make up historical fiction, or someone who came later, a century later. These people lived within the time frame where the memories would have still been around, and people who still lived. So it could be tested, it could be corroborated or not. They were kind of under more of a microscope if they lied. So they're trying to be very clear and careful with their reporting.
Questions will answer if the Gospels meet the following standard: timely, reliable, unparalleled, and eyewitness-based. True. This will not settle every historical or theological question raised by the Gospels, but it can help us answer a more basic one. What kind of documents are we dealing with?
Wait, what am I looking at right now?
Let's begin with the first question. Were these accounts written close enough to the events for their claims to be checked?
what Luke says, he's talking about the events that occurred among us, and he's saying, I'm writing this to confirm what you've already heard. So it's like Luke can't be just making up new stories. But also there have been a number of comparisons made with other ancient historians, Dionysius of Halicarnassus and so on. The prefaces in these others look very much like the preface that we have in Luke 1:1-4.
You can show parallels, especially in the preface to Luke Acts and Luke 1:1-4, with Herodotus and Thucydides in terms of the mention of eyewitnesses, the involvement of the author, I myself, it seemed good to me, mention of being involved from some earlier time or the first and things like that.
Those are like Greek and Roman historians. They'll use like Luke knew those historians and used their same standard of talking when he wrote his gospel to show, hey, I'm writing this as a historical document. So Luke is a legitimate historian here.
Mention of the history. Luke uses the term diegesis, which is a historical narrative. He uses the term logos, which I think in this context means history as well, like Herodotus does.
Luke is telling his readers that he's reporting events they have already heard about. But what kind of work would a first century reader think they were reading?
When you compare the Gospels with other comparable works in antiquity, the way most people would have approached them is a full work about a particular figure of history. They would most naturally approach it as a biography.
Writing later in the 2nd century, Lucian describes the standards expected of serious historical writings in the Greco-Roman world. The comparison is not that Luke followed Lucian's manual, but that Luke's preface reflects similar concerns about sources, investigation, and truthful reporting. This is something that I've discussed previously.
You know, the content of the stories of Jesus that we find are in these biographies that we refer to as the Gospels. When we find the Gospel biographies of Jesus being written, it's really at the height of ancient biographical writing as a genre. This is when we get ancient individuals like Plutarch, Suetonius, Tacitus, and so on, writing biographies of important figures within their day. However, between these 2 points, between proto-biographical material and hagiographical material, we find the written classical world of what we refer to as the crown of ancient biographical sources. It's during this time that we actually find standards being laid down by ancient individuals, historians like this guy named Lucian, who writes a document titled How to Write History. And he stresses...
Lucian was kind of a proto-historian, doing their best to be historians, around, I think, the 2nd century AD. But, you know, he's the point here is that Luke, writing his history, is right in the middle of a wave of ancient historians trying to set a certain standard for the way a historical document should look and how it should reference historical events. So Luke is a physician. I like Luke. He's probably not going to be my favorite because he wrote Luke and Acts, and he's a physician, and he tried to be accurate, and he tried to use some sort of like accepted standard for the day in order to get across his history. So that's also important because Luke was using the Greco-Roman type standards when he talked about the year of Tiberius Caesar or whatever, which helps. We have to put it on the Greco-Roman way of seeing whatever year it was. You know, the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar would be calculated by the way the Romans do it, because he had to stay in the standard of a historical narrative that all the other historical narratives are in. And that's what these PhDs are kind of backing up. So when it says that in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, Jesus was turning 30 years old, then he was turning 30 in 29 AD, because we know the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar was in 29 AD. So if he's turning 30 in 29 AD and there's no year 0, he was born in 2 BC. And then you got to reinterpret when Herod died. But when some people say Herod died in 4 BC, Herod the Great, that's going to be faulty because of a mistake Josephus made. And you can only get correlate his death to our calendar based on Josephus. And I can go over that another time. I have on my videos before. But if Herod died in 1 BC, like a lot of newer historians are thinking, then it matches with Jesus' birth in 2 BC. My point is that Luke, when he says in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, he means according to the Greco-Roman world, because Luke's trying to imitate these other historians like Lucian did later as well.
Things like impartiality, detachment, and rigorous devotion to the truth that characterizes an ideal historian. And Luke, in his gospel account of Jesus Christ, in the preface, exemplifies what things and standards like Lucian are talking about when we see him saying that he's undertaking the task of writing an account. And to do so, he's interviewing eyewitnesses, and he's carefully investigating everything from the beginning.
And biographies in antiquity, they kind of varied in how reliable they were historically by modern standards. But the period in which ancient biography...
Okay, the 4 Gospels are written between AD 40 and AD 100. Probably all earlier than we used to think, than some people used to want to say. It's still within the lifetime of the events. So if the events are, it's got a 0. There's no year 0. Okay, it goes from 180 to 1 BC, no year 0. But I understand why they put that, because you got to calculate things numerically. You have to have a 0. But 0 would be 1 BC, and minus 1 would be 2 BC, and 1 would be 180. There's no year 0. So if you're going to do calculations, you have to put the number 0 on 1 BC. So 0 is 1 BC. Okay, 80, 40 to 100. So that's when like the books. Some people think that Mark was written around here. That's just like less than a decade. I believe Jesus was crucified in 33 AD and resurrected, etc. in 33 AD. And therefore, within a decade, Mark is writing Mark. He'll show that in a minute. But all these Gospels are written within the lifetime of people who were living at the time of Jesus, which is very important. So it doesn't matter they're written like day of. Certainly notes could have been taken. Why not? They could have taken notes. But they would have like written it down formally in the Greek between 40 and 100.
What was most historically reliable was the period of the early empire, which is the very period in which...
It's showing the different historians, just straight up historians. You have to, what they're doing is they're comparing Luke as a historian to these other guys. Does Luke look more like a historian, a contemporary historian from this time frame? Because these guys lived early in the, first century. This is telling you 100 is right here. So Plutarch's early. This guy's just into the 2nd century, these two. But they're Roman historians, okay? Does Luke look more like these Roman historians, or does he look more like Apocrypha, which means magical type secret documents that came later, much later, and became more legendary and idealized? Like you got in these apocryphal documents, Jesus turning clay birds into real birds. Kind of very fantastical things, miracles with no reason. Childhood life of Jesus never spoken of in the Gospels. You start coming up with crazy stories. So is Luke more of a crazy story guy, or is he trying to be historical? And this scientific endeavor is going to show he's more likely historical, much more likely.
The Gospels were written.
These authors were close enough to the events to investigate their claims, and they were writing in genres where truthfulness and the use of sources were recognizable expectations. One of our most important surviving accounts of Alexander the Great was written by Arrian in the 2nd century AD, more than 400 years after Alexander's campaigns.
It's ancient history.
By comparison, Mark is commonly dated to around AD 70, approximately 40 years after the public ministry of Jesus. That does not automatically...
That is like a... I remember that wrongly. But I do think some people put it more like 50 AD. That's going by like the most liberal scholars. They still put it... They put it in 70 AD. That's where they're trying to put Mark. But within the lifetime of Jesus. Within the lifetime of people who are living still. So some people are still alive when Mark's writing it, who would have been alive at the time of Jesus' ministry, around AD 30. Like I said, if Jesus is turning 30 in 29 AD, that's when his ministry began, his public ministry. And I'm using Luke, where it says in 29 AD, well, in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, Jesus was turning 30, and that's when he was baptized. And so his ministry was from his baptism until his crucifixion. So between 29 and 33 AD, about 3.5 years.
Around AD 70, approximately 40 years after the public ministry of Jesus. That does not automatically make Mark accurate, because 40 years is less than 400, but it places Mark within living memory, when consulting sources and challenging its claims was still possible. As we see later, Acts contains evidence that its author had traveled with Paul, and was writing within living memory of the events he described.
You look at the Gospels and Acts, I believe these are what historians of antiquity call contemporary history. They're written in the lifetime. They're narrating history up to their own time, so they can be checked. They're in a position to know.
Have you read George Van Coten's article on this? He has a recent article on NTS on the dating of John.
I have, yeah.
John says that there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate this pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda. There is this pool with 5 colonnades. And then he argues, based on like a broad linguistic analysis, that this particular phraseology where John's saying there is in Jerusalem at this time, that it implies strongly that like these colonnades are standing now.
The second part of his argument.
Okay, the point there is, if it was written post 70 AD, those colonnades would not have been around. And if John's writing just offhand, if you're like writing in the future and trying to push it back into time, you're probably not going to naturally do this. You have to be really calculating to write it that way, or you just wrote it that way because you were there.
This particular phrase is broad, and then he argues. Aramaic is.
Come on. Yeah. So, there is in Jerusalem. That sounds like he's writing from while that stuff's there. That's just a natural way you would write. So it seems to indicate that the text of John dates back to pre-70 AD, and that it's not corrupted. And it's pre-70 AD, because this wouldn't have been there after 70 AD when the Romans razed it all to the ground and burned it up.
Called Bethesda. There is this pool with 5 colonnades. And then he argues, based on like a broad linguistic analysis, that this particular phraseology where John's saying there is in Jerusalem at this time, that it implies strongly that like these colonnades are standing now.
The second part of his argument then builds off of that, and he argues based on both Flavian and post-Flavian sources. So anyone discussing Jerusalem after its destruction in 70 AD, that there was a wide general awareness that Jerusalem was completely destroyed.
I'm going to look at these closely. Pliny the Elder. This is, okay, right after 70 AD. Jerusalem is no longer one of Judea's toparchy and is a heap of ashes. I want to show you that 70 AD did happen, according to historical records. This thing I'm talking about, when it was razed to the ground by the Romans. This guy, Jerusalem, is burned out. Titus is blackened with the dust of... This is Titus the Roman, is who destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD. He's blackened with the dust of Solomon. I don't know what that is. Visitors tread Solomon's ashes. I guess that's the word they use for Jerusalem. Oh, here it is. Solima is an ancient Greek and Latin poetic form or shortening of Hierosolima, Jerusalem. Appian, Vespasian destroyed it. The Roman emperor razed Jerusalem to the ground. That must have been the emperor at the time, but the general was Titus. Jerusalem was utterly destroyed. Hadrian replaced Jerusalem in 130 CE with a new city in place of the one which had been razed to the ground. So all these historians, unrelated to the Bible, attest to the fact that happened.
Totally decimated. According to Van Couten, this would have included a distinctive landmark, like this colonnade pool complex. And here, although it's not a perfect analogy, he uses another famously destroyed landmark to make his point. the Twin Towers.
John was making this claim after 70 CE. It'd be like me making the claim that Wes and I had a great chat, while the Twin Towers were still standing. This little editorial remark of John's occurs in that final editorial layer. So you can't just argue that, well, John put this little detail at one time in the initial.
Seems quite probable that the inclusion of Gentiles as a part of the audience would belong to the last stage of redaction.
Draft, and then a later compiler went added it. This is in the final layer. And I think that's really significant. I thought it's compelling. And of course, it builds off of Daniel Wallace's article, which in itself was already compelling.
Whatever we conclude about Van Kooten's argument for dating John's Gospel before 70 AD, the general point of what we've covered so far is simply this. The Gospels were written at a period in history, and within such a time of the events that they describe, that the standards of historical reportage would have been at their highest. In that sense, the Gospels are timely. Being close to the events does not prove that an account is accurate, but it makes the account testable. So what happens when we actually test the details?
There's only one way to find out.
If you want to understand how things work, especially these
commercial,
days,
I get
this
past
game
it.
is for you. You're not.
One place we can do that is with names.
Wow. That's what's so interesting about trying to interpret this stuff. So you have to think about it in the terms of the culture of the times.
And one of the most interesting ways...
Joe Rogan and his ridiculous incredulity.
that we figure out, okay, how can we tie, say, the Gospel of Matthew to the first century in Judea is studies that have been done on name frequency.
I need names.
So this is called onomastic congruence, where we look at the most popular names within a particular...
Okay. The degree to which the sets of names within the biographies of the early Roman Empire correspond to the naming patterns expected for the relevant population, place, and period. So, do the Gospels in the book of Acts usage of names follow the pattern of the frequency of those names at the time? Or is it, you would expect that to be if it was more historical? If it was, because the random people that you just interact with, the more and more names you pile up, the more it should look like the distribution of those names at the time. Because right now we have more popular names like John and less popular names like Ruby. Back in time, maybe more women were called Ruby than they are now. Now more women are called Amanda, right? So, at the time of the Gospels being written, are the names that it uses, and the Gospels and Acts, because you have a large number of names there, so a large data set, do they follow the pattern of the time or not? And it's quite amazing. And they go over this in detail. This is pretty cool.
Geographical area, and we compare it to how names are differentiated. While I've discussed names in the past, there's so much new work being done in this area. We'll get to that later in the video, but first, let's set the stage. We can compare the relative frequency of names in the Gospels and Acts with names found in external sources documenting Jewish names from first century Palestine. The question is not simply whether the writers used plausible ancient names. It is whether the overall pattern of common and uncommon names corresponds with what we find in the wider population. How closely do the relative frequencies of names in the Gospels and Acts correspond to those in extra-biblical source documenting Palestinian Jewish names?
I think they correspond quite well in two different ways. The first way is sheer frequencies, and we can see this best with the male names because there are just too few women to do a frequency analysis. And you get what I like to call a swoopy name distribution. That is not a technical term, but in this swoopy, it's called
Okay, remember this pattern. When it comes to more common names, this is showing looking at the available historical data from the time, Roman and Jewish writings and things like that, and like whatever documents they dig up, they do this. They do name frequencies. So this is established scientific data, and this is this box here is the historical, and this is the Gospels. This is the Gospel and Acts. It follows the same distribution. Okay? It follows the same roughly the same distribution in the Gospel and Acts as to the frequency of names in the region. She's going to explain it.
Pareto-like distribution, you have relatively few names which are accounting for a much higher proportion of the characters than you would expect if you were just sort of grabbing them at random. And then you've got sort of a medium set of names. I call those tier B, and they're accounting for the next set of persons, and then it tails off down over here to the rare names. And you find that swoopy distribution with a
So there's just a few names that everybody uses. Today would be John and Peter and stuff like that. Names that you hear a lot and that overlap with. There's just a few names, but there's a lot of them. And then there's not that many of the rare ones in the population.
The same names in the Gospels and Acts taken together to contribute to a database of male names that you find in these external sources that have been put together, for example, by the Israeli scholar Tal Ilan. So that's really interesting.
The important point is that this is not merely a collection of names that could have existed. It is an accurate distribution of those names. A relatively small group of names accounts for a large proportion of the people. A second group appears less frequently, and then the distribution trails off into many rare names. The name frequency found in the Gospels and Acts reproduce approximately the same patterns.
First group, second group, third group.
Found in the external data. But Lydia identifies a second pattern as well. It contains what the writers do when a common name could cause confusion.
We're looking for people 40 plus who want to actually master Claude in 28
This is a commercial.
No free time needed, just 10 minutes a day. Nexera gives you interactive bite-sized.
We use last names in our culture or nicknames, and we're likely to add those where there's a possibility of unclarity about which person by the name of Wes, for example, we're talking about. I have several Wesleys among my Facebook friends. You're only one, so I use I notice their last names to make sure I'm reading the right person, right? And they had something a little bit like that. Things like the town you were from, who your father was, who your son was.
These are different Simons that are in the New Testament or in the Gospels. Simon the Tanner. So they don't really have last names. They might say son of their dad, or they didn't include that one. But this is what he did for a living. This is what he had at one time. Then he was healed, so he's known as the leper. And this is where he came from. So they would, of the rarer names, they would make him. Or I think these are the not as rare names. They would have to, there's so many people having the name. Yeah. There's so many people with this name. They got to make it less ambiguous and separate them somehow. So this is a common phenomenon, not only in the Gospels, but in other historical writings.
Who your husband was, if you were a woman, what your job was, like Simon the Tanner, or even some disability that you had suffered from, like we have Simon the leper in the Gospels. I'm sure he wasn't still a leper at that time, but the poor guy got that stuck onto him as his disambiguator for the rest of his life because he had once had leprosy. And what we find in each of the Gospels is that they're giving these disambiguators in approximately the right places where something really is a common name.
So there are two related patterns. The relative frequency of the names corresponds with the external evidence. And when a name is common enough to create confusion, the writers are more likely to add a distinguishing detail, such as a hometown, relative, occupation, or other identifying feature. These are the kinds of incidental patterns we would expect if the writers were drawing on information about real people from the historical setting. Name patterns are one form of corroborative evidence. Lydia McGrew has also helped recover interest in another historical tool, an undesigned coincidence. McGrew has discussed more than 20 potential examples in the Gospels alone. We could summarize an undesigned coincidence as an incidental detail from one account that appears to unintentionally explain a detail in another account.
Undesigned coincidences were different puzzle pieces fit together from different documents. Also, something I call unexplained allusions, where something will be brought up and then dropped in a kind of a casual way. Unnecessary details. All of these contribute to an understanding of the Gospels as memoirs rather than highly literary productions.
These tools become very powerful for determining the epistemic value of historical literature. You can find many scholars. William Paley is mentioned in the standard histories in our field, New Testament studies by William Baird, the Book of Acts by Ward Gask. There are others, Bishop J.B. Lightfoot, F.F. Bruce, Colin Hamer, C.F.D. Moule. These are traditional scholars, like redoubtable great historians who mention undesigned coincidences.
The reasoning here is cumulative. One apparent connection could be accidental. But when accounts repeatedly corroborate one another through small details, those connections can add to the historical value of that.
So there's multiple connections you can find between the Gospels, independently written. Josephus, independent, with no skin in the game on the truth of the resurrection or anything, or he's not trying to like corroborate these guys. He doesn't even care about them. Yet he'll say something that Luke independently said. And just like I think he's going to, link it back to that original example from the beginning. But there's multiple examples of it.
Testimony.
So there's not like, these guys aren't making it up. It comes along later that someone corroborates. So they're trying to be historical.
Compares this with tools used to evaluate testimony, such as multiple attestation. Independent testimony becomes more significant when separate witnesses corroborate one another without appearing to coordinate their accounts. Luc Vandeweghe has discussed potential undesigned coincidences in Luke and Acts and in Independent Memories of Anne Frank's life. Craig Keener has identified similar connections in the works of Tacitus and Suetonius. And we have already seen one example. The connection between Luke's detail about Cusa and the historical context supplied by Josephus.
To review that, this name, which is managing Herod's household, his name is that's a Nabatean name. And then here Josephus says, hey, by the way, Herod married a Nabatean princess. Oh, and this is like a side. Luke just said it on the side. But by the way, there's this guy. Like, do you remember, if you've read the gospel, do you remember this guy's name? I don't. But look into Luke 8:3, there it is. It's not like he's not like a major player in the gospel narrative. Luke just mentions it because Luke wants to be a historian. He's being a historian. And he wants to show that he's a historian. So he's mentioning, relevant side little markers for who he's talking about and showing, hey, I have some knowledge here about this whole subject matter because I know this fine detail. And he mentions it in passing. And then, so Luke does that in other places too, like with the census of Quirinius. He mentions something in passing, but he doesn't fully explain it. And probably there was two different times when Quirinius was in power, and he doesn't say it outright. But in the book of Acts, he seems to indicate another time Quirinius was at a different role. So history's kind of lost some of that, but Luke's kind of mentioning it in passing. And one of these days, if we ever dig up a document, we may have a similar unintentional connection here that they're talking about. Here, we just got lucky that Josephus mentions it. So when Luke is backed up by Josephus here, too independently, that, hey, I've got a Nabatean name as a manager, and Herod had a Nabatean princess that he married. Well, obviously, Cusa was with her and became his manager, right? Between the two accounts, we get the whole picture, and it wasn't intentional. So if we're missing something over here that Luke said over here, we're just missing it. So we don't have Josephus necessarily thinking to corroborate Luke over here. So I can believe Luke over here, even though I don't have any other historian out there corroborating it yet. And maybe never, but I'll take a look at his own historian because he matched another places really well. So where he doesn't match, he's believable. And I think that's important, especially for things like the Quirinius situation. There was a time when people didn't acknowledge Pontius Pilate as a historical figure until it was dug up some thing up in Caesarea Philippi, I think. That was a recording of something Pontius had stated, and it got put on a big rock, a big display. Pontius Pilate's name is in it. Like, oh, he did exist. It just took a while to find some evidence. Same thing will happen with some of the other stuff Luke says that some people question, such as the census. But down the road, we're probably going to find out. First of all, that census, when you put it in the right context, it's probably when Caesar was declared father of the country in 2 BC, at the time of Jesus becoming born. When people put his birth before 4 BC, that's when they lose that connection. But so Luke is holding up when you look at him historically correctly. That's all I want to say about that. But this is one example that I can use in the future to say where I don't have a Josephus or somebody backing up something Luke has said. But here, in some crazy little reference that he backs him up, I'm going to believe Luke in other places because he's showing to me that he's legit by these other unintentional connections here. I think that's really important.
That's the kind of incidental fit we're talking about. These patterns do not prove every event described in the Gospels by themselves, but they show that when ordinary details can be tested, the names correspond with the place and the period. Common names are distinguished where confusion could naturally arise, and completely separate accounts fit together without being aware of the other. That is what we mean here by reliable. But could a well-researched author of fiction reproduce the same patterns? What happens when we apply these tests to historical novels, apocryphal accounts, ancient histories, and other works that mix history with fiction? Do they hold up in the same way?
An angel came down after that dark day.
Good Lord.
Someone writing a novel can research the past. They can read ancient histories, borrow real names, include genuine locations, and surround invented characters with accurate historical details.
100 years from now, nobody will know the difference.
So the next step is comparison.
False Gospels of the Gnostics.
What happens when we apply the same tests to works that used historical sources, but combine that information with fictional or legendary material?
Challenge accepted. No.
Luc Vandeweghe has refined and expanded Tal Ilhan's database, including new names supplied by Ilhan herself. Working with statistician Jason Wilson of Biola University, they have completed extensive additional work on names. Much of this is already published, while all of it will soon be available in a new book with InterVarsity Press. They did not only test the Gospels and Acts, they also analyzed names from the Babylonian Talmud, apocryphal texts, modern historical novels such as Ben-Hur and The Spear, and modern mystery novels researched and set in the ancient world. Then they compared the results with works generally recognized as history, including the writings of Josephus, Suetonius, and Plutarch. The question was straightforward. Which kinds of writings reproduce the name patterns of the populations they claim to?
So is it going to look more like the Roman historians of the time, or is it going to look like more the apocryphal texts and some of the crazy stuff? And is the crazy stuff going to look like Plutarch and them? So where's Luke going to fit in Acts and the Gospels in general? And where's the crazy stuff, the apocryphal writings? And when I say crazy stuff, I'm talking about the Gnostic Gospels and the other infancy Gospels and stuff that come 100 to 300 years after the first century.
Describe.
If I kind of take the skeptic's view, I don't think they would say that the Gospels and Acts authors could have made up the names as well as they're represented in the Gospels and Acts. I think they would probably argue something like, well, Gospels and Acts authors, they had some traditions, maybe they're authentic with names in them. Then they embellished those traditions but kept the names. And then maybe they added some names from like Josephus, and that's how we got proper names from the Gospels and Acts. And so what Jason and I have done in our formal statistical analyses is try to tackle this very question. So rather than just looking at name stats in the Gospels and Acts, we also analyzed name stats in works that actually did use Josephus and did rely on historical narratives. And those would be like modern novels like Ben-Hur and The Spear. Also sets from the Babylonian Talmud and from apocryphal Gospels. And these data sets were put together.
They're taking historical fiction and crazy stuff. Babylonian Talmud's full of nonsense, when it comes to some of this. So they're taking like obvious crazy stuff and looking at the patterns to answer the question to the skeptic. Is this just later on intentional trying to grab names or not?
Together by a skeptical scholar, so we didn't massage the data, we used theirs. And then we even look at Latin names in like Greco-Roman biographies, and then like modern mystery novels, very well researched, set in that place and time. And so from all these tests, this is a lot of work that I'm just like condensing into like a soundbite. From all these tests, sample size really matters. Obviously, the bigger your sample of names, the more confident you can be like in your conclusions. And the gist of it is that when you have a set of names from the Gospels and Acts, that size, or even Luke Acts, that size, out of all the studies that we did, there's no source that we investigated and looked at that has as many names, for example, as Luke Acts, that correctly correspond to the general population statistics, that is not also a work of history. In other words, like at the size of Gospels and Acts and Luke Acts, appropriate naming patterns are a feature of historical reportage to the extent that we've been able to observe and analyze this. So we have no example for, just as an illustration of an author or set of authors taking a historical tradition, embellishing it, but then still having the proper name patterns at this size of sample.
All right, so the guys that made up nonsense and made historical fiction, they won't match the pattern. That pattern I showed you before, they're not matching that swoop she called. They're not matching the swoop. And this graph is showing the degree at which they match the swoop. And it's saying we have when we have a larger sample size, the confidence goes way up. This is all 4 Gospels, including John. John by itself has a small sample size, but when you include it in a larger sample size, it has high confidence. Much more so than homilies of Clementine and Ben-Hur, which are historical fiction. They don't get names correct. They don't get the pattern of names correct. These get more and more pattern correct when you include all 4 Gospels and Acts. It's way up there. So it looks more like they're really historical. They're really back in time. They're not making this up. Because when you make things up, you tend to make up names that you just don't get right. Because no one's that, especially back then. They're not thinking like us right now. They're not thinking, I got to make the names match. When somebody statistically looks at all the names in my area, nobody thinks. The common man is not going to. A common hoaxer is not going to think like that. So it's looking more and more like they really were written, statistically must have been, in the first century by eyewitnesses, or derived from eyewitnesses.
History. In other words, like at the size of Gospels and Acts and Luke Acts, appropriate naming patterns are a feature of historical reportage to the extent that we've been able to observe and analyze this. So we have no example for, just as an illustration of an author or set of authors taking a historical tradition, embellishing it, but then still having the proper name patterns at this size of sample. So all of that is really indicative and informative when it comes to how we think about the Gospels, because, these name patterns are a feature of information retention that's typical of individuals using source materials. Look
at that. The ones that didn't match, it didn't show a graph, but I assume Josephus, Suetonius, Plutarch, and Gospel and Acts are all up here sharing the same high probability with the other historians. And this stuff stays low, and he included in that bunch.
Of individuals using source are a feature of
the Babylonian Talmud, historical novels, apocryphal nonsense, and Roman historical mystery novels. All this doesn't match the names well. It stays on the low end of that curve, and all these are on the high end of the curve. Nice. Including Gospel and
typical of individuals using source materials, trying to actually inform the reader about things that truly happened rather than trying to entertain him about things that didn't.
That qualification is important. Luc Van de Wey is not claiming that no fictional writer could ever reproduce an accurate distribution of names.
We got to make it look real.
He is saying that among the sources they have tested, once the sample reaches the size found in Luke Acts, or the Gospels and Acts together, every source that accurately represents the population is also a work of history. The fictional and legendary works they tested did not reproduce the same pattern, even when their authors had access to genuine historical sources.
If you're a side sleeper, this almost feels
It's all really
Every
cool.
side sleeper is making this
Very
exact
helpful
same
information.
mistake.
There's a novel by a Catholic author named Louis de Wohl. It's called The Spear. De Wohl has definitely researched. It's very clear that he has Josephus available to him. And he gives instances of things that are told about in Josephus, but not in the Gospels, so he's using both. It's a novel of the time of Christ and the death and resurrection of Christ. De Wohl had the resources of research available to him, but he does not understand name statistics. So this shows how hard it is to get name statistics right. It's not even just being exposed to names. It's not even just reading a lot of text like Josephus. You have to be thinking statistically in a way that de Wohl is clearly not doing. And we can see.
So you have to think statistically to fake it. And if you're not thinking that way, you're not going to be able to reproduce it. But the guy who's just living it is going to naturally reproduce it without even thinking about it. The guy that lived in the time. So this is huge evidence that the Gospels were written at the time that Jesus walked the earth. That they're reflecting that first century time, without a doubt.
That in his use of disambiguation, which I mentioned before. De Wohl just disambiguates all over the place. So he's picked up the fact that in the Gospels we have Judas the son of James or something like that, that they would use these disambiguators, and he just does it all over the place. He just does it all the time, even with extremely rare names.
The problem is not that de Wohl failed to research his novel, but he applied those identifiers too freely, including to rare names that were unlikely to create confusion. The distinction becomes visible when those disambiguators are counted.
Wow, look at that. In The Spear, he's got rare names with disambiguators, like Simon the leper. You only would do that to common names. If you had a bunch of Chris's, you got to somehow this is Chris, the guy that did this is the Chris who did this, Chris the doctor, versus Chris the car worker, versus Chris the guy that got a brain injury, whatever. You have you have to differentiate those, the common names. But the rare name, Frankie, no one's named that anymore. So that would be, you wouldn't need to do a differentiator, but this guy didn't pick up on that. He's like, sees so many characters in the Bible with Simon of Cyrene and stuff, then he's just going to go like, I'm going to have a little name for everybody. So clearly that wouldn't have been the true pattern back then. So he didn't know of these patterns to watch for. No one would have back then. And yet they stuck with the normal way it should look if you're from that time. So, you can't just like hear the names and like, and as you're making things up, stay consistent. You're still going to mess up.
The table
if you're making it up.
Disambiguation in the Gospels and Acts with modern historical novels and apocryphal text. Notice that in the Gospels and Acts, the most popular names are consistently disambiguated more often than unpopular names. But that relationship does not appear consistently in the fictional and apocryphal works.
Didn't work, Nigel.
These statistics are particular.
I just like looking at this stuff again. Popular or properly done. Standard or close. And then he goes crazy on rare names. He keeps differentiating them. That's so funny that they can analyze that.
Relationship does not appear consistently in the fictional and apocryphal works.
Didn't work, Nigel.
These statistics are particularly interesting because the gospel writers could not have anticipated we would be able to test their writings in this way. They could not have known that nearly 2,000 years later, researchers would compare their names with population databases, mathematical models, historical novels, and apocryphal writings.
They don't know that we know they know we know.
And the distinction is not limited to names. It becomes especially clear when Acts is compared with other ancient narratives that present themselves as accounts of apostolic activity.
There's an interesting anecdote from William Ramsay. He was like the pioneer ancient historian in Asia Minor. And he took with him the Acts of the Apostles, as well as what he called, at least at the time, were other second century apocryphal texts, basically historical fictions. Because William Ramsay thought that they would give him some kind of historical value. They have verisimilitude, and he might use them. He says, and we don't know exactly, well, we can infer what caused his change, but he says that in the process of his research, he actually separated canonical acts out from the apocryphal texts because he became aware that this is actually a work of history and not a historical fiction.
Ramsay's conclusions came from using these texts while studying the places they described. Nathan Nadeau also points to a distinction that can be measured more directly: chronological arrangement. Historical narratives tend to locate events within sequences of time. They tell us that something occurred 3 days later, that someone remained in a city for several months, or that a journey took a particular number of days. These references created a chronology that can potentially be checked.
You could compare the apocryphal acts. There are Acts of Andrew, Acts of Paul, Peter, Thomas. None of them favorably compare with Acts regarding what an ancient historian would call chronological arrangement. Really, it's only the Acts of Thomas that you can even compare because it's the only one that's not too fragmentary to compare. But by comparison, in terms of this chronological arrangement and specific time indicators, there are 5 references to time across 67 pages in the Acts of Thomas.
Only that much?
Martin Luther, he said, "I want to make Moses so German that no one would suspect he was a Jew." Now that can...
In the book of Acts, there are 125 time references.
Look at that. So Luke in the book of Acts is trying to reference everything to time, to something this happened before that, or this many days, or that many days, or whatever. He's trying to give time references. And this fake thing called the Acts of Thomas doesn't pay attention to that. Tries to kind of emulate it, but doesn't do it like a guy who's really serious about it. This is just an attempt at emulation and trying to look like it's a book of Acts. But it's not being serious about it. So it's such a difference than even when you're faking it, you can't. They're trying to provide to make it look like the book of Acts. They can't. He's not doing it right. And this is why, when I read some of these books, when I read some of these Gnostic books and some of these later false gospels, you can tell if something's just off in many ways, theologically as well. But it's just off. It just doesn't ring true. Like a gospel, they're telling a story over time with time references and things. And while the Gospel of Thomas is much like the Acts of Thomas here, it's just like there's no time references. It's just lines of sayings Jesus said with no corroboration. There's no context given. I don't know when he said it, where he said it, who he's saying it to half the time. When you read it's just a line. It's 114 lines in the Gospel of Thomas, and there's no context at all as to when any given thing was said, and they're all obscure sayings to begin with, meant to make you think you're stupid and that you don't know anything. That's the point. Like you need a secret cult to help you understand. It's just written for such a point of view that's obviously foreign to anything historical. But I want the historical. I don't want the, redheaded stepchild later on.
These do, as you carry the narrative along. And we're talking about things like 3 days later, they were there for 6 days, they were there for 7 days, Paul was there for 3 months. It was the middle of the night. These sort of permeate and they increase as the narrative of Acts goes on. Far and away are different from the apocryphal texts. But when you compare Acts to Josephus, they're pretty much right on a level in terms of their time indicators. That's one among probably a number incidental markers that help us actually go in and determine, oh, is this a text that is probably using sources, has eyewitnesses, is trying to accurately record some kind of information about the past, or is this a narrative that merely has verisimilitude?
The comparison is not simply between the Gospels and obviously careless fiction. The historical novels were researched. Some used Josephus and the Gospels directly. The apocryphal works incorporated genuine people, places, and traditions. They could reproduce the surface appearance of history. But in the data sets examined so far, they did not reproduce the same population-level name patterns, the same relationships between common names and disambiguation, or the same abundance of chronological markers.
Yeah, so they get the pattern wrong. However much they try to just use what they're seeing in the older texts and make a fiction out of it, they still get it wrong. They can't keep to it. These follow the available data of the ancient names, etc. So it's quite interesting.
The sources that did reproduce those patterns were works of history. That is what we mean here by unparalleled. Not that no fictional work could ever contain any of these features, but that the combined patterns found in the Gospels and Acts have not been found in the comparable fictional and legendary works tested so far. That brings up our final question. Do these first three indicators support the claim that the Gospels and Acts are based on eyewitness testimony? One place to consider that question is the Gospel of John. A recent book titled Archaeology, Jesus, and the Gospel of John, What Recent Discoveries Show Us, brings together a number of scholars examining John's knowledge of travel distances, typography, specific locations, and the general environment of first century Judea. Craig Evans, one of the contributors, describes these ordinary details as mundane verisimilitude, an ordinary everyday detail that rings true and reflects its historical setting. Evans asks why the Gospel of John contains so much of this material. He writes that this
is kind of interesting because Luke is collecting eyewitnesses and telling the chronology, and trying to get everything right when it comes to his history. This happened before that. This guy was this person's Nabatean household manager, etc. John is just lived it because Luke was not a original 12 of the apostle or anything. He came on a little later, but he knew all those guys and he took their history. He took their testimony, their eyewitness. He took their eyewitness testimony, right? So Luke's kind of compiling and getting it right as a historian. John is writing it as if he lived it. He's like a diary of his own life. So he describes all this topography and all this distances between one thing and another very, very well. So accurately, you can tell it's written by someone who lived it, who was there. Because John is the actual guy who experienced all these things. So I'm really reading something from a guy who lived with Jesus. When you read John, that is a fact. You are reading a guy who lived with Jesus. You have to trust him. So that's why I always tell people to read John first, because he comes off so authentic, because he lived it. And the data backs it up. This book, I'm going to have to get it. What's it called? Oh, here it is. Archaeology, Jesus, and the Gospel of John. What recent discoveries show us.
Archaeology, Jesus, and the Gospel of John, What Recent Discoveries Show Us, brings together a number of scholars examining John's knowledge of travel distances, typography, specific locations, and the general environment of first century Judea. Craig Evans, one of the contributors, describes these ordinary details as mundane verisimilitude, an ordinary everyday detail that rings true and reflects its historical setting. Evans asks why the Gospel of John contains so much of this material. He writes that the simplest answer is that underlying the fourth Gospel is eyewitness testimony. The mundane verisimilitude is most readily explained as the kind of thing one expects to find in narratives and stories sourced in eyewitness testimony. And mundane verisimilitude is what one does not find in late, fictitious writings that pretend to be written by people who did not write them. An accurate location or travel detail does not by itself prove eyewitness testimony. Evan's argument is cumulative. When a narrative repeatedly preserves ordinary information tied to a particular time and place, eyewitness testimony becomes a reasonable explanation for where the information came from. The evidence becomes even more direct in the book of Acts. At several points.
Again, so like John wrote the thing. John wasn't like Luke collecting everything from other people and trying to get it all correct from direct eyewitnesses. That's what Luke did. John was the eyewitness, so he wrote it as if 2 miles down the road is my kid's school, and 10 miles in is where I go to church and all this. It's something you would just know because you lived it. So if John's accurate on all that, and he is when you compare it to what's known of Judea, then I kind of trust him when he says other things. So I'm going to go with John as the writer of John being John, and what he's telling me is true. He lived it. So he walked with Jesus. So the Gospel of John is going to be the most accurate gospel. All four are accurate, but when we're comparing to other like false gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, etc., the Gnostic Gospels, the ones that came later that have the word gospel but aren't really, they're 100 years after the fact. They're not within the lifespan of the people involved. They're way after. That's when they were written in the mid-hundreds AD. You don't trust those. And here again, the Gospel of John is coming out, and the other Gospels, but he's specifically talking about John here, to rise up to top. Now he's going to mention Luke and Acts as well. So you much rather trust them. So if something's called a gospel, that's what you trust. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John.
In Acts, the author changes from describing what they did to describing what we did. These sections are commonly called the we passages.
Scholars have debated about whether the we actually reflects the author or an eyewitness source. Majority of scholars think it does reflect eyewitness material. But for those who don't, I'm like, this is one of the silliest things to debate about, personally, because if you actually read ancient historians and ancient biographers, when they say we or they say I, in just about every other case in ancient sources that I know of, they actually are claiming to be there, or they're claiming to be speaking.
The argument is not based only on the author's use of the word we. The change occurs during particular sections of Paul's travels, and those sections preserve detailed information about routes, timing, geography, and local conditions. The amount of details in the we passages goes up. I think it's something significant, like 20% compared to the rest of Acts.
A leading Acts scholar, Steve Walton, did a dissertation on the speech in Acts 20, verses 18 to 35, and parallels with 1 Thessalonians. So it's just that one letter of Paul, that undisputed letter of Paul, showing how it matches Paul's speech, because this was the one public speech to believers where Luke was present, and so it's where you would expect the most parallels. And
Keener's point is that if the author was present for the speech in Acts chapter 20, we might expect that particular speech to resemble Paul's own writing. According to the study he references, that is what we find when the speech is compared with 1 Thessalonians. That does not mean Acts preserves a word-for-word transcript of everything.
The point being, Luke witnessed Paul giving that speech. Paul standing up and preaching. Luke witnessed it. And he reflected Paul's way of talking so closely that when you compare it to things Paul wrote, and they picked 1 Thessalonians because even among liberal scholars, that's the least debated. Yeah, they think he wrote that. Then you can say okay, Luke was there. This guy that wrote Acts, he was there for some of it. So again, it dates back to the 60s AD when he wrote it. This is all ancient, old stuff that goes back to the time of Jesus, close to it. It goes back to the original eyewitnesses of it. It's way more believable than anything that came later. And it really did come before. It really is first century. It's not later hoax stuff. And it's not corrupted. It's reflecting accurate eyewitness testimony.
Paul said.
Word for word.
Word for word. It is one more correspondence that fits the author's claim to have been present. The strongest example of detailed first-person narrative comes later, during the voyage and shipwrecks described in Acts chapter 27. Luc Vandeweghe, building on the work of Colin Hemmer, has observed the way Acts spells names to reflect local settings, identifies places along the journey, and describes the practical conditions of ancient travel. Acts chapter 27 is particularly significant. The author describes the voyage and shipwreck in meticulous detail. He follows the journey through specific ports, changing winds, delayed navigational decisions, dangers, and actions of the crew. The account also includes Greek transliterations of Latin sailing terminology, the kind of expressions the author could have heard from the Roman crew operating the ship.
Because of Acts 27 and the shipwreck account.
Oh, hold on. Luke was on that ship. And he heard these guys.
This professional 32 terabytes SSD, capable of holding the entire collection of the New York Public Library, is something you won't find at Best Buy or any electronics retailer.
I think it's almost unavoidable Luke was present in that.
Hang on. Gosh. Luke heard these guys talking and using their sailor phrases, and then he includes it in the things he's talking about. The north wind and so, what did it show? Hang on. This is too interesting to me.
The author.
Euro Equilo, the northeaster. So he's taking Latinized phrases and turning it into Greek. Latin phrases and turning it into Greek. And preserving that way of talking. That's not a normal Greek way of talking. So he's using the sailor's terms. The northwest wind, the ship's boat. So he was on this trip that Paul took in his missionary journey.
Could have heard from the Roman crew operating the ship.
Because of Acts 27 and the shipwreck account, I think it's almost unavoidable Luke was present in that, based on my studies in it.
That is what we mean by eyewitness based. It does not mean that every part of every gospel comes directly from the author's personal memory. Luke explicitly says that he used material handed down by eyewitnesses and that he investigated the events before writing his account. The argument is that eyewitnesses...
Okay, this is why we have multiple gospels, you know. For example, Matthew's written to show Jesus was a king to the Jews. And Mark's kind of probably the earliest one, I think they say that he kind of succinctly says everything. Luke tries to find eyewitnesses' accounts and makes it very chronological and makes it a historical level document on purpose, which I was talking about earlier on in this video. And then John, he lived it. So he's a direct eyewitness of the whole dang thing. And there's things in him that correlate with what you would expect of an eyewitness, and not someone who came along later who wouldn't have known the topography and how much distance between one thing and the other and what time of year this would look this way. He gets it all correctly. So it's more and more evidence that he lived it. So if you're going to read about Jesus, you're going to read you're going to read John, and you're going to believe John. And John, John says Jesus died on a cross and rose from the dead. He was there. He was at the tomb. If everything else he said was an eyewitness account, you just have to not believe him. And if someone says, read this, reference this gospel in the past, you need to look at the gospels, and you look at it and John says he rose from the dead. Well, you got to believe it because that's the true gospel. He did rise from the dead. So it just comes down, it challenges you to actually believe or not what the original gospel said, the original true gospel that dates back to the time of these events. And these studies are showing more and more that that's the case. This whole video has been showing that.
This testimony lies behind these writings, and that portions of Acts appear to include the author's own participation in the events he describes. That completes the 4 parts of the cumulative case. We began with one obscure name. By itself, that one connection proves very little, but it is one example of a much larger pattern. The Gospel and Acts were written close enough to the events for their claims to be investigated. Their names and the ordinary details correspond with what we know about the places and the periods they describe. When those patterns are compared with historical novels, apocryphal accounts, and other works that combine history with fiction, the Gospels and Acts repeatedly behave more like the works recognized as history. And in Acts, the author shifts into first-person narration during particular journeys and preserves detailed knowledge consistent with someone who participated in those events. That is the cumulative case. These accounts are timely, reliable, unparalleled in the comparable fictional work tested so far, and eyewitness-based. Now, historical evidence has limits. The names, statistics, geographical details, and undesigned coincidences cannot, by themselves, prove that Jesus is the Son of God, that he performed miracles, or that he rose from the dead. Those claims require further historical, philosophical, and theological consideration, which myself and these other scholars discuss.
But if you're going to believe a source material, that source material has got to prove out to be accurate to the day. And these Gospels do. So, for example, if the Quran says to read and compare to it, read the people of the book, read the Gospel, and read the Injil and Torah. Injil means Gospel. Then the only Gospel that dates back to the time of Jesus that carries any weight are the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And if John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh, and we beheld his glory as of the only begotten Son of God, then that's John who lived with Jesus and was told that by Jesus, and he reflects it. And he writes, this is what Jesus, the prophet man, the one that came down to earth, born in a manger, this is what Jesus said. Jesus told me these things. So if these things are bearing out that, hey, what John says and what Luke says do correlate with known historical patterns and choices of names in the books, to all the way to topography and places and weather patterns and eyewitness accounts that correlate with what other people have said, such as Josephus and Paul writing later in Thessalonians. If things kind of match up unintentionally, that's just more and more cumulative evidence that it dates to the time it's supposed to. And it's the trustworthy spot where we need to go to compare anything to. It's the standard. And if things come along later that don't behave according to that standard, they're rejected. And you stick to the standard. Because all we want is the truth. The truth is what matters. So you got to believe what John said. But John is the Gospels. John is one of the Gospels, one of the four. And there's four so that there's separate accounts of the same events that corroborate to provide more and more evidence that they are true, rather than just one man's account standing alone. You have four, and really with Luke you have multiple, because Luke used the eyewitnesses of multiple people to make a historical document. And like this guy was showing, the Luke's historical document matches what a historical document should look like when you compare it to Plutarch and Suetonius and those guys. Luke looks like one of those statistically. So it just is what it is.
In detail in videos, books, and our research. But we shouldn't move from that limitation to the opposite conclusion and treat the Gospels as late legends or works of historical fiction. The evidence we have examined points towards authors writing within the living memory, drawing on genuine historical sources, preserving the testimony of people who were there, and attempting to report events they believed actually happened. That is what it means to say that the Gospels and Acts contain historical reportage. A very special thank you to Dr. Luc Van de Wey for his extensive help with the research, preparation, and original script for this video. I also want to thank Doctors Lydia McGrew, Craig Keener, and Nathan Nadeau for taking the time to discuss this evidence with me. And of course, thank you for watching.
That's what I'm saying. That's a good one. I don't know who Count Nicholas is, but man, that's good. Do the work of God, preach the truth, the resurrection of Christ, die. You'll be with the Lord, and the next person will come up and do it. So I don't know. That's what I'm going to do tonight. I wanted to go over that because, man, that stuff's too good. And I'll probably just leave it at that. And I'll be back another day doing something else. Goodbye.